Welcome to my front porch. It's quiz time, and I'm your quiz master, Sean. And I've got questions for you, baby boomers. Well, let's see here. Let's search our minds. Let's resurrect our memories. Let's see what we know and what we remember. And by we, I mean baby boomers, because today it's all about trivia for the golden baby boomer generations. Art, history, science, politics, television. It's all there. And us youngins will learn something along the way. So, let's have a little fun, shall we? All right, let's get started. What have I got here? Which 1960s TV show featured a family of monsters living at 1313 Mockingbird Lane? The Munsters, The Twilight Zone, or Dark Shadows? It was The Munsters. All right. What was the original name of the band that would become the Beatles when John Lennon first formed it in 1956? The Quarrymen, the Blackjacks, or the Silver Beetles? 'Twas the Quarrymen. Which controversial novel by Ken Kesey, published in 1962, was based on his experiences working in a psychiatric hospital? Sailor's Song, Sometimes a Great Notion, or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? It was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. What was the name of the first communications satellite launched into orbit in 1962? Was it Explorer 1, Sputnik, or Telstar? The first communications satellite was Telstar. Which 1950s advertising campaign featured the slogan, "Winston tastes good like a cigarette should," controversially using the like instead of as? Marlboro, Camel, or Winston? It's Winston, because the grammar is what makes that bad. What was the original purpose of WD-40, developed in 1953? Rust prevention for Atlas missile parts, waterproofing for camping equipment, or cleaning agent for industrial machinery? Its original purpose was rust prevention for Atlas missile parts. Which technology company introduced the world's first commercial transistor radio in 1954? Sony, RCA, or Zenith? And that company was Sony. What iconic children's toy was originally marketed as the Magic Cube before being renamed in 1980? Slinky, Rubik's Cube, or Etch-a-Sketch? Originally, that was the original name for Rubik's Cube. Which musical film released in 1965 featured Julie Andrews twirling on an Austrian mountainside? Mary Poppins, The Sound of Music, or My Fair Lady? It was The Sound of Music. The hills were alive, you know. What was the name of the NASA program that immediately preceded Apollo? Was that Mercury, Gemini, or Voyager? And that was the Gemini program. Which 1950s automotive innovation was marketed as the safest suspension ever built? Radial tires, disc brakes, or air suspension? It was air suspension. What groundbreaking TV show debuted in 1951 and starred Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz? The Honeymooners, I Love Lucy, or Father Knows Best? That was I Love Lucy. Which band's 1967 album featured a controversial cover that was quickly withdrawn, showing the members in drag with baby doll heads? The Who, The Doors, or Jefferson Airplane? It was The Who. What was the first commercially successful videocassette format? Betamax, VHS, or U-matic? First commercially successful format was U-matic. Which American department store chain introduced the first in-store credit card in 1958? Was it Bloomingdale's, JCPenney, or Bank Americard? The American department store chain was, that was Bank Americard. Which counterculture figure published Steal This Book in 1971? Timothy Leary, Abbie Hoffman, or Jerry Rubin? And the counterculture figure was Abbie Hoffman. What was the first commercially successful mini-computer released in 1965? The IBM System 360, the Apple I, or the PDP-8? It was the PDP-8. Which Cold War-era civil defense film, featuring an animated turtle, became infamous for its duck and cover technique? Atomic Alert, Duck and Cover, or Survival Under Atomic Attack? It was Duck and Cover. What was the first music album to sell over 20 million copies worldwide? The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Michael Jackson's Thriller, or the Eagles' The Greatest Hits, 1971 through 1975? It was Eagles' The Greatest Hits. At the time. Which television game show, debuting in 1956, was involved in a notorious scandal when it was revealed contestants were giving answers in advance? The Price is Right, What's My Line, or 21? It was 21. What was the name of the first satellite launched by the United States in 1958? Explorer 1, Vanguard 1, or SCORE? The first satellite launched by the United States was Explorer 1. Which fashion designer introduced the revolutionary new look in 1947, featuring nipped waists and full skirts? Christian Dior, Hubert de Givenchy, or Pierre Balmain? Christian Dior. What was the first toy advertised on television? Was it the Barbie? Was it Silly Putty? Or was it Mr. Potato Head? The first one to be advertised on television was Mr. Potato Head. Which 1970s film featured the tagline, "The story of a man who wanted to keep the world safe for democracy and meet girls"? MASH, The Graduate, or Easy Rider? That tagline belonged to MASH. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric razor, introduced in 1931, but reaching peak popularity in the 1950s? Philishave, Remington, or the Sunbeam Shave Master? It was Sunbeam Shave Master. Which psychedelic drug became widely used in the counterculture of the 1960s after being synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938? DMT, mescaline, or LSD? It was LSD. What was the first successful credit card to be used nationally in the United States? American Express, Diners Club, or Visa? The first one that was successful. That was Diners Club. Which popular American situation comedy of the 1950s featured the character Ralph Cramden? Leave It to Beaver, The Honeymooners, or was it Father Knows Best? It was The Honeymooners. What kitchen appliance, introduced to American homes in the 1950s, was originally called the radar range? Was it the electric can opener? Was it a food processor? Or was it a microwave oven? It was a microwave oven. Which 1960s TV show featured a theme song that began with the words, "This is a story of a lovely lady"? Was that the Brady Bunch, Bewitched, or the Flying Nun? That was the Brady Bunch. What was the first successful oral contraceptive approved by the FDA in 1960? Orthonovum, Inovid, or Lostrin? And that would be Inovid. Which 1967 film featured Dustin Hoffman being told, "I want to say one word to you, just one word"? Plastics, The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, or Bonnie and Clyde? That's from The Graduate. What groundbreaking home video game console was released by Magnavox in 1972? Atari 2600, Intellivision, or Odyssey? And that was Odyssey. Which controversial novel by J.D. Salinger became a defining book for the baby boomer generation? On the Road, The Catcher in the Rye, or Slaughterhouse-Five? And that was The Catcher in the Rye. What was the first artificial satellite to transmit a voice message from space in 1958? Was it Sputnik 2? Was it Project Score? Or was it Vanguard 1? It was Project Score. Which 1966 album by the Beach Boys is considered one of the most influential in rock history, despite being a commercial disappointment at release? Was it Surfin' Safari, Pet Sounds, or Summer Days and Summer Nights? It was Pet Sounds. What was the original purpose of Play-Doh when it was first manufactured in the 1930s? Was it a children's toy? Was it a wallpaper cleaner? Or was it a medical therapy tool? It was a wallpaper cleaner. Which television personality hosted American Bandstand from 1956 to 1989? Was it Casey Kasem? Was it Dick Clark? Or was it Ed Sullivan? That was the always young Dick Clark. What was the name of the first fast food hamburger chain in America, founded in 1921, but reaching nationwide popularity in the 1950s? Was it McDonald's, Burger King, or White Castle? It was White Castle. Which 1960s political movement was known for the slogan, Black Power? The Congress of Racial Equality, the Black Panther Party, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? It was the Black Panther Party. What innovative kitchen appliance was patented by Ruth Wakefield in 1954? Was it the garbage disposal, the dishwasher, or the electric can opener? It was the dishwasher. Which 1969 music festival was originally planned as a profit-making venture, but became a free event when hundreds of thousands of unexpected attendees showed up? Was it the Isle of Wight Festival, Woodstock, or the Altamont Free Concert? That was Woodstock. What was the first commercially available portable calculator released in 1967? The Texas Instruments SR-10, the Sharp EL-8, or the Busicom LE-120A Handy? It was the Busicom LE-120A Handy. Which television show's 1960 premiere featured Rod Serling saying, "You're traveling through another dimension"? Was that Outer Limits, The Twilight Zone, or One Step Beyond? That was The Twilight Zone. What was the first commercially successful photocopier introduced by Xerox in 1959? Was it the Xerox 914, the Xerox 813, or the Xerox Copier 1? It was the Xerox 914. Which science fiction author coined the term grok in his 1961 novel Stranger in a Strange Land? Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, or Robert A. Heinlein? That was Robert A. Heinlein. What was the first commercially successful instant coffee brand introduced in 1938, but becoming a household staple in the 1950s? Maxwell House, Folgers, or Nescafe? That was Nescafe. Which 1967 film, directed by Mike Nichols, featured the Simon and Garfunkel song Mrs. Robinson? The Graduate, Carnal Knowledge, or Catch-22? That was The Graduate. What groundbreaking computer programming language was developed by Grace Hopper in 1959? Was it Fortran, COBOL, or Pascal? And that was COBOL. Which 1950s TV Western series starred James Arness as Marshal Matt Dillon? Bonanza, Gunsmoke, or Rawhide? James Arness starred in Gunsmoke. What was the first commercial passenger jet airliner to enter service in 1952? Was it the Boeing 707, the Douglas DC-8, or the de Havilland Comet? It was a de Havilland Comet. Which television journalist hosted CBS Evening News from 1962 to 1981 and was known as the most trusted man in America? Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow, or Chet Huntley? Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it was, through 1981. What was the first popular commercial antacid tablet introduced in 1930, but becoming a medicine cabinet staple in the 1950s? Tums, Rolaids, or Maalox? That was Tums. Which 1968 film featured HAL 9000, a sentient computer? Was it 2001, A Space Odyssey, Planet of the Apes, or Barbarella? 2001, A Space Odyssey. What was the first successful commercial deodorant introduced in 1888, but achieving mass popularity in the 1950s? Old Spice, Right Guard, or Mum? It was Mum. Which counterculture figure wrote The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test in 1968? Tom Wolfe, Ken Kesey, or Timothy Leary? And that was Tom Wolfe. What was the first commercially successful portable transistor radio, introduced by Regency in 1954? Was it the Sony TR-55, the Regency TR-1, or the Emerson 888? It was the Regency TR-1. Which 1970 documentary film about the Woodstock Festival won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature? Gimme Shelter, Woodstock, or Let It Be? It was Woodstock. What was the first commercially successful video cassette recorder for home use? The Sony Betamax, the Philips N1500, or the JVC HR3300? It was the JVC HR3300. Which 1960s Broadway musical featured the song The Age of Aquarius? Hair, Godspell, or Oh, Calcutta? And that's from Hair. What was the first commercially successful anti-anxiety medication commonly prescribed in the 1950s and 1960s? Valium, Librium, or Miltown? And the first successful one was Librium. Which 1950s advertising campaign featured the character Speedy Alka-Seltzer? Bromo-Seltzer, Alka-Seltzer, or Pepto-Bismol? Well, of course, that would have to be Alka-Seltzer. What was the first successful portable tape recorder introduced in 1950? The Sony TC50, the Ampex 600, or the Nagro 1? And that was the Nagro 1. Which television show, premiering in 1966, featured a Pontiac GTO converted into the Monkey Mobile? The Monkees, the Mod Squad, or Batman? That's the Monkees. What was the first successful commercial artificial sweetener introduced in 1957? Was it Sweet and Low, NutraSweet, or Splenda? The first successful artificial sweetener was Sweet and Low. Which 1968 science fiction film directed by Franklin J. Schaffner featured Charlton Heston discovering a disturbing truth about his new world? Planet of the Apes, Soylent Green, or the Omega Man? And that one was the Planet of the Apes. What was the first commercially successful video game? Pac-Man, Computer Space, or Pong? The first commercially successful video game was Pong, and still my favorite. Which political activist founded the Youth International Party, the Yippies, in 1967? Jerry Rubin, Tom Hayden, or Mark Rudd? And that was Jerry Rubin. What was the first commercial television network in the United States? Was it NBC, ABC, or Dumont? The first commercial television network was NBC. Which 1964 film starring Peter Sellers featured the memorable line, "Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room"? Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, or Being There? Dr. Strangelove. What was the first commercially successful desktop computer? The Apple II, the IBM PC, or the Altair 8800? the first commercially successful desktop computer? That was the Altair 8800. Which counterculture novel by Tom Wolfe, published in 1968, chronicled Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters? The Right Stuff, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, or The Radical Chick and Mawing the Flatcatchers? The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. What was the first commercially successful disposable diaper, introduced in 1961? Love's, Huggies, or Pampers? The first one was Pampers. Which 1971 film, directed by William Friedkin, featured a car chase through the streets of New York City? Bullet, The French Connection, or Dirty Harry? It was The French Connection. What was the first commercially successful home video game console? Was it the Atari 2600, Intellivision, or the Magnavox Odyssey? That was the Magnavox Odyssey. Which counterculture publication, founded in 1967, featured the slogan, "All the news that's fit to print"? The Village Voice, the Rolling Stone, or the East Village Other? The East Village Other. What was the first commercially successful pocket calculator? The Hewlett-Packard HP35? Was it the Busicom LE120A? Or the Sharp EL8? It was the Sharp EL8. Which 1969 film, directed by Dennis Hopper and starring Peter Fonda, featured the tagline, "A man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere"? Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider, or Five Easy Pieces? It was Easy Rider. What was the first commercially successful instant photography camera, introduced in 1948? Was it the Kodak Instamatic, the Polaroid Land Camera Model 95, or the Fujifilm Instax? It was the Polaroid Land Camera Model 95. Did you get all that? Which television personality hosted The Tonight Show from 1962 to 1992? Steve Allen, Jack Paar, or Johnny Carson? That was Johnny Carson. Here's Johnny. All right, you've done an amazing job. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and share button. And share your score in the comments below, will ya? And check out these videos. They're a lot of fun too. Catch you next one. Bye-bye.